We all know I love First World War subjects, so in this video I'm going to be building this FT-17. Now the FT-17 is the forerunner to the modern tank, and this one is tiny. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. So this FT-17 in 1/72nd scale comes from the company Flyhawk, which is normally known for ship models, but they do a few small armour pieces and they are really nice. This one retails for around £15 and has 2 kits in the box, so it's pretty good value. The instructions are fairly straightforward, and in this version, the riveted turret, there are 2 paint schemes to choose from. The kit comes with 2 sheets of photo etch for each of the 2 individual kits, a sheet of transfers of which you'll only be using a few, and of course parts for 2 1/72nd scale FT-17s. These are all nicely bagged up so you won't be losing any parts. Now for 1/72nd scale, the detailing on this kit is fantastic. A few of the parts are slide moulded, the rivets and panel lines are really crisp and in scale, and generally this kit oozes detail. Because of the size of the vehicle, the parts count is relatively low. But like I said before, everything is nicely moulded. The tracks also look pretty nifty, it looks like they'll go together with no drama. Let's get on with the build. The first job were to attach a couple of small photo etch parts. Now the photo etch parts in this kit are not optional, they are mandatory to finishing the model. But that being said, there isn't any tricky folding to do, it's basically just gluing photo etch parts to plastic. And to prepare them, they were removed carefully from the sprue, and then any excess metal nubs were sanded with a fairly coarse sanding stick. Well, this is more like a sanding pad, but you get the idea. Once these photo etch parts were cleaned up, they were glued in place with VMS Black Flexi CA. Always being careful but sometimes unsuccessful at getting any on my fingers, the super glue was applied into place with a toothpick. And because the glue's got a little bit of working time, the parts were popped in place and then adjusted to fit. Following the construction steps, the next part to glue in place was the bottom of the hull. This was glued in place with VMS styrene cement, and the fit was really good. When it comes to the photo etch parts, not all of the parts are mandatory, a couple are optional. The 2 grab handles for the driver's hatch are supplied as separate etch parts, so you can either remove, like I did, the plastic parts or leave them in place. To get rid of mine, I used my God Hand sprue cutters and then carefully sanded away the excess plastic. Once that was done, the driver's hatch was dropped carefully into place. The running gear was the next part of the build to be put together. This is fairly straightforward, but there are a few ejector pin marks that you will need to clean up to get the 2 halves of the running gear to fit nicely together. Otherwise you'll end up with a fairly visible seam. The next job was to put on some of the small parts and miscellaneous details onto the hull. This was fairly straightforward, but some of the parts are very small, so while there wasn't any complex building, it was quite fiddly. I thought the photo etch tow hooks would look best if they were glued in place at a slight angle against the hull. So to do this, I just held the parts in place with tweezers until they dried in the position that I wanted them to. Moving on to the sides of the hull, the shovel was added, and when this was glued in place I moved on to the side brackets for the storage bin. These come as either photo etch or plastic parts. If you use etch parts, they're one of the few optional parts in the kit, and they do need folding, but it's not a big job. The kit comes with a choice of 2 guns, a small howitzer and a machine gun. The howitzer was dropped in place before adding on the rest of the parts of the turret. You can glue the tracks on at this point, but I decided to leave mine loose. I did test fit them though to make sure they fit nicely. And they do. 4 minutes in and we're already onto paint. A quick note, at this part of the build, my needle was busted. But it was good enough to apply some primer. For this I used some Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. thinned around 70% thinner with MLT. Next up, I used Tamiya German Yellow 2 from their lacquer range. This was thinned again with MLT, and the paint was built up in a black based way. Even though the paint was heavily thinned, I didn't really like how it sprayed. I think this might be better with something like a 0.2 or 0.3 needle and nozzle combo instead of my 0.15. It just felt a little granular, but quite likely it's a skill issue. With most of the shading done, it was time to apply a blend coat. This brings the shadow and the main colour together, so it doesn't look so stark and horrible. This was done with the same Tamiya lacquer paint, but thinned even more. And the colour was lightly misted over the model and built up to opacity. I did have some misadventures trying to spray paint the camo on this tank, and it went completely wrong, so I decided to brush paint the camo instead. For the green, I used a mix of AK 3rd Gen US Olive Base and Vallejo Flat Green. To paint the hard edge camo, I first painted the outline very carefully with a fine sable brush. The middle areas were then filled in, and once everything was dry, it was given a second coat of paint. There were a few annoying details to paint around, but with a bit of patience and perseverance, it came out okay in the end. And with the green done, it was time to move on to the red-brown. For the red-brown, I used a mix of AK 3rd Gen Red Leather Brown with Vallejo Hull Red. Again, this was painted on really carefully, painting the outline and then the inside. And again, a few coats were needed to build up to a smooth, opaque finish. To prepare the tracks for weathering effects later on, they were painted with a medium grey. I brush painted one but quickly got bored and sprayed the other. And now it's time to apply the decals. The surface was prepared with VMS Decal Set and Fix. The decal was soaked for about 5 seconds before being set aside for the decal to release from the backing paper. This was then carefully slid into place, and once it was dry, it was given a coat of VMS Decal Softener. Several reviews online state that the decals on this kit aren't very good, but although they felt a bit pasty, they were okay. And they went down onto my matte paint without any problems or silvering. What more can you ask for from a decal? They also settled over rivets nicely with VMS Decal Softener, so as decals go, they were alright. In preparation for weathering, everything was then sealed in with VMS Satin Varnish. In the first stage of making this model look more interesting, I painted all the raised details with lightened versions of the base colours. First up, all the rivets were picked out. Because this was so small, it didn't take very long, which is good because this can be a really tedious job. Next up, I added some micro scratches. This was done with a superfine brush and Vallejo German C Black Brown. To my paint, I added a drop of VMS Paint Retarder. Because I was working with such small areas, I didn't want the paint to dry. Well, I wanted it to dry, but not very quickly. I built up these microchips over the entire tank, making sure to pay attention to grouping to make sure they look natural. A few scratches were also added with the same paint. Next up, to add some definition to the tank, I made up a wash with Abtalung 502 Shadow Brown and VMS Universal Weathering Carrier. This was painted over all the rivets, in all the panel lines, and around all the details. Already we can see the finish turning from something bland into something a bit more interesting. But due to a lack of vigilance, as you can see here, on the turret the wash didn't look very nice. But it's dry now, so I'm going to have to move on with adding some mud effects. I used Abtalung 502 Industrial Earth and Bitumen to add some grotty stains to the lower sides of the tank. This is in preparation for some more extreme mud effects later. I used a streaking and a dabbing motion to blend these oil paints in. That's the thing I love about oil paints, you can rework them until you're happy, even remove them if you're not happy, so they work really well for me. Just a bit more blending and this section will be done. To prepare the tracks, I stippled them with Vallejo German Sea Black Brown. I then brushed over some highly faint Abteilung rust colours. Most of these won't be seen, but it'll add to the effect. Next up, we're going to add some heavy mud to this first aboard tank. I'm using this fine grey earth diorama texture from VMS. But to make it stick better, I'm going to mix it with some oil paint. So I added a couple of dollops of this earth to my palette, and mixed it with some industrial earth and shadow brown Abteilung oils. This goopy mixture was then spread around the running gear and underneath the tank, really any areas that would pick up heavy mud. This was definitely the messiest part of the build, but it was also the most fun. I'm hoping the oil paint will work as a kind of glue to keep this texture on the tank. So, fingers crossed. As I mentioned earlier, the mix was also spread around the bottom of the tank, and on some of that unditching skid. On the sides of the vehicle, I had to make sure to be careful to blend the mix into the previous effects, so there was kind of a transition and it wasn't jarring. Next up, I started to add some moisture effects. For this I used Abteilung's engine grease. This comes out slightly glossy, so should help the mud to look like wet mud. It should, but it didn't really do a lot. So I used a mix of almost black oil paint. I think I mixed in some black with some shadow brown. This mix was brushed on areas that I wanted to look really wet and dark. And in my mind this vehicle was working in wet and muddy conditions. So most of it was dark and wet. The same mix was painted on the tracks. I figured as the tracks were turning, moisture would still collect on the upper surfaces, so that's why I added wet effects here. And with my wet effects, that's the Flyhawk FT-17 finished. Honestly, I don't think this is one of my greatest builds. It just feels a bit uninspiring, but it was really fun to add those thick, textured mud effects. And way before YouTube, I did make a 1/35th scale Meng version of this tank, so it was nice to revisit it but on a different scale. Let me know what you think in the comments. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of my work. I try and keep the subject matter varied, so there should be something for everyone. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.